I'm Tracy Austin, your host of the People Strategy Podcast. This show provides interviews with organizational leaders and ongoing coaching experiences that highlight elevating people in organizations through a people strategy roadmap.
In a leadership status or in a leadership point of view, you kind of have to take the step back saying, you need to get it done. You're not the one actually doing it. Does it really matter all that much, how it gets done as long as the end goal is the same across the board?
Hi, I'm Tracy Austin, host of the People Strategy Podcast, where we dive into the latest trends and best practices in talent management and organizational development. Today, we are chatting about change management, and we are in the middle of a very special leadership development series with Adam Gruszcynski from Potawatomi Casino and Hotel. So welcome back, Adam. This is number 6, I think, of 8?
Number 6. Good morning, Tracy. Thanks for having me back again.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Conflict resolution. What comes up when we think about conflict resolution?
I think my initial thoughts have changed since I've taken a leadership role, more so that you actually have to work towards resolving more conflict that you're not necessarily in the middle of, or have the conflict with someone else that you have to identify conflicts within your department or your teams that you lead and manage. And when you kind of spot the conflict occurring, need to do something about it so it doesn't detrimentally affect the team, whether it's, from a production standpoint or from a culture standpoint. And sometimes, I'm going to be honest, it feels like you're dealing with high school drama in your work environment, because sometimes the conflicts can be petty and small and silly. But to the people involved in the conflict, they may not seem that way, that they could actually be a big problem for them. And if you don't resolve them, could affect the workplace in a negative environment.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that there's so much to unpack here, right? And first is conflict necessarily bad?
No. Sometimes conflict can be good and help evolve something that you're working on, or the dynamic of the team, into something better. And sometimes you need to have that conflict.
Yeah, for sure. And it's like, when I look at conflict, it's like, all right, what is the reason for the conflict? A lot of times the presenting issue really isn't what the conflict's about, but it could be 3 or 4 layers underneath it, right? So it's like, all right, what created the conflict to begin with? Is it multiple competing priorities that is essentially because there's a lack of communication or understanding? Is it that there's a personal issue that's bubbling up that nobody really knows about? Is it somebody's triggered by something that has nothing to do with this person? Like, what is it really?
Right. And sometimes it could be, the person just woke up and is going to have a bad day and everything rubs them the wrong way. And, that happens to all of us. And sometimes you just got to, put up with that for that day. And when that person comes back tomorrow, it's like the conflict never even happened.
Right. For sure. For sure. So one of the things that we love to do, and we kind of talk a little bit about this in our leadership development program, is the different types of workplace conflict. Because when we can start to determine really where is the conflict coming from, now we can start to resolve it. So there's really 4 types of conflict that we typically see. So I'd like to kind of walk through this, and then we can chat a little bit about it. But there's conflict around tasks, the task conflict on what needs to be done. There's process conflict around how it needs to be done. And then we have status conflict, where it's like, all right, when conflict, comes up, who needs to resolve it, or where does that happen? And then, of course, we have relationship conflict, where it gets personal, which tends to be the hardest to resolve.
Right. It's more emotional than it is, just needing to achieve something for the betterment of the team, department, or organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And so it's like, if we go back to these different types of conflict, task conflict, process conflict, status conflict, and relationship conflict, if we think back to the accountability conversation that we had on a previous podcast, really talked about designing accountability. Well, when we design accountability, we're removing some of this task, process, and status conflict.
Sure. And I would say yes and no to that. When you design the accountability and you have accountability, you do remove an element of it. But sometimes, from the task, process, status, the analogy of there's many ways to skin a cat, can come into effect, where, all right, you need to do this task. In my head, I think I know how it should be done, whether that's the right way or the wrong way, it doesn't matter. And then the person who's actually responsible for doing the task might have a completely different way. It might not be as, fast or efficient or the way, the other person would do it, but in their head, that's the way they want to do it. And that can just cause a conflict because, the people don't agree how to get to the end goal. And I actually see that, more often than I would expect that, and that's in a leadership status or in a leadership point of view, you kind of have to take the step back saying, you need to get it done. You're not the one actually doing it. Doesn't really matter all that much, how it gets done as long as the end goal is the same across the board.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that within process conflict, there's a couple of different items that pop up. And one of them is, how long has that person been in that role? And do we
Mhm.
necessarily care about the how? There's certain things where the how really does matter when there's processes that is 100% linked to that. But for the most part, if we think about how we lead others the way they need to be led, allowing them to come up with that how can be so incredibly useful. One of my favorite books is The Answer to How is Yes by Peter Block. I have not
Hey,
dropped a book on you yet in this series, so I decided it was about time. And
I
I
was going to
think,
say, well, you trying to give me more reading material here?
yeah. And if you are not in on this joke, Adam has joked with me that I've given him way too many leadership books in the course of our podcast for him to
Mhm.
read.
That's not
Um,
necessarily a bad thing.
no. So, but if we think about that kind of like the answer to how is yes, that process conflict, sometimes it's going, okay, here's what we're agreeing upon the outcome. And if there's enough trust in that team as to the how, but it's also
Right.
ensuring that we understand the impacts through to the end.
Mhm.
And sometimes we're making conflict where conflict doesn't need to be made.
Right. And I think if, you link back to a couple of topics we've talked about in the previous podcast, accountability and culture, that if you give, the person assigned that task more free rein to decide how to achieve it, you're just going to help build that culture, which is going to spread throughout the team or teams and the department. And then the accountability is like, well, this is the way I think we should do it. So I'm holding myself to a higher level of accountability because this is what I think we should do, which just benefits the overall structure of your team dynamic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
So I'm curious, when you're working with folks or you see conflict arising, how do you do some problem resolution around that conflict?
Sure. So if I can see, conflicts brewing, I try not to get involved right away. I try to give it some space and see if the people involved themselves can figure out that they are having a conflict and they can come to a resolution in some way, shape, or form on their own. If I don't see that happening, I tend to pull one of the people involved in the conflict aside and just say, hey, I see this issue is occurring between you and the other person, is what's really at the heart of the problem. And I try to just sit down and try to understand their point of view and then say, hey, I understand where you're coming from. I think maybe this is where the other person's coming from. Can you guys just schedule a 5 minute, meeting or get together and try to work through this, on your own? Because if not, the next step is, well, kind of like you're in school and you got to go to the principal's office. Both of you are going to sit in my office and we're going to come to a resolution by hook or by crook. And I would prefer not to do that. I would rather have you guys organically come to, a solution instead of me sitting in the room trying to be a moderator. And
Right.
that,
And
that
sometimes you need a moderator, right?
sometimes you do. Sometimes you do because the conflict is deep and one person feels really strongly about it and maybe the other person doesn't, and can lead to talking loudly, and you want to try to curb that because that's not healthy for the environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the things that we talk a lot about within our leadership development program is, how we potentially deal with conflict. And, there's the different types of ways that folks will communicate.
Mhm.
And when I list these, I think that we're all going to go, okay, yes, I've heard this, but what does this actually mean? So we've got the passive, we have the aggressive, we've got the passive aggressive, and then we have the assertive communicator. And I'm curious, how do you kind of assess that and coach those folks in the middle of a conflict so that they truly can solve some of those things on their own?
Yeah, it's funny when you sent me the outline of this particular topic, and it got to passive aggressive. Like I was like, ooh, I was guilty of that once. And
I think we
it's
all
kind of,
were. Like,
a topical story. Right. I before I got into my management, role here, I was on the networking team, and that management position opened up and I applied for it. And I felt I was the best candidate for the job. And I think a lot of people in the department did too. And I did not get the job. It went to someone else who I felt was not qualified and just politicked better than I did. And I was resentful of that, and started showing the traits of a passive aggressive where I was at work, but I let everybody know I was not happy with the situation. I would still do what was asked for me. If someone needed help, I would still do it. But,
there
my
wasn't a
facial
chip on your
expression,
shoulder at all, was
attitude,
there?
there might have been a big chip on my shoulder, and I wanted to everybody know that that chip was there while still doing my job. And eventually, the director of the department pulled me inside, and we had a heart-to-heart conversation about what happened, and that you know that chip on my shoulder got removed. Um, and it's sometimes you don't you're doing it and you don't want to, but you don't know how to get past it. And it took me, having a sit down conversation that I think was, close to 40 minutes about what transpired to like work through what I felt were, this grievous offense of not getting this promotion, and realizing there was some more logic behind it. And that I think that happens to everybody.
Right. Right.
Mhm.
And, if we're going to talk about leadership for a second, if we think about that leader of saying, okay, here's something that is not serving you, Adam. It's also not serving the department. It's not
Mhm.
serving this new leader. And there's a huge opportunity for growth within this. So taking the
Mhm.
time to, and my guess is that you felt very heard within that conversation so that you could
Yes.
reassess the thoughts that you were having, thus that led to removing the chip.
Correct. Yeah, and we came up with, we walked through a different scenario that put me on a different career path that I am now, that path led me to where I am today. So at the time, I thought it was, not the best move for the organization. I wasn't happy about it, but turned out it eventually led to this. So there, while I might not see you might not see the big picture in the immediate, there is typically a plan or something, better down the road. You just have to be willing to, work to get to there.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is a really interesting conversation. I'm going to veer off for a second and come back. But there's so often where I will get called from a manager or an HR director that's like, hey, Tracy, Kara just left, and we're so upset because we had plans for Kara to move into the next 3 levels and this and that. I'm like, well, did Kara know about it? They're like,
Right.
well, I think so. And I'm like, well, did you ever talk to her about it? Well, no. Okay. So when we have this breakdown in the communication gap, I mean, guess what? Unfortunately, we are not mind readers, and our teams are not mind readers either.
No.
As much as we would like them to be, they are not, and
Mhm.
neither are we. And what happens when we don't have all the information is we make up stories that are probably 10 times worse than what the actuality of the situation is. And thus conflict is born.
Yep. I 100% agree with that. Yeah, you're going to create a narrative in your mind that is way worse than what is actually happening in reality, and it just breeds miscontent and ill will. And like you said, no one is a mind reader here, as much as we would all like to have that ability. The only way to become a mind reader is to actually tell the people you're interacting with what you're thinking, what your plan is, what's the vision and future of the person's path, at the organization.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So, what I'd love to do, if you're game for this, is we want to make sure for our listeners that you're getting a ton of value out of these, out of these episodes. But I'd love to walk through kind of the passive aggressive, and assertive, and really kind of what that looks like as far as the traits and the behaviors that shows, but also how do we support that person to shift them out? And you just gave a really great example within that passive aggressive. Does that sound like a
Sure.
plan?
Sure. Absolutely.
So when we see someone who's passive, and I will use an example of this is, I have an HR manager that I've been working with for quite a while, and we do some coaching together. And so we'll coach, and, I'm saying, hey, she'll bring forward a scenario where she feels like, hey, I wasn't heard at all. I brought this information forward to the team, and the leadership team didn't do anything with it. And I said, okay, so did you name the impact of that to the team? Nope, I didn't at all. I said, okay, so how did you share the information with the team? Well, I let my director send it out. I said, okay, so how does that have you feel and show up? Well, I just closed down. I go, okay, so why did you let the director send it, but yet you're upset about it not being shared in the right way? Well, I want to have a great relationship with that director, right? So there's 3 traits we just kind of talked through that are typical of a passive behavior: difficulty expressing themselves. They tend to give in to others when others are saying, hey, this is what needs to happen. They just say, fine. Do you ever catch words with your team? It's like, fine, good,
Whatever.
yep. Like those are triggers that there's something else underneath. And when we can hone in on that, you love the coaching that's happening in this.
Mm-hmm.
And when we can hone in on what's underneath that and start asking questions about it, now we're creating a space that has some psychological safety in it. So, some of the behaviors that we see with passive folks are difficulty making eye contact, the inability to say no. So, hey, can you do this? Yes. Can you do this? Yes. Can you do this? Yes. Right. They'll go with the flow with everything that's happening. And a lot of times we see this in our body, right? Like we'll see this with this really poor posture, or folks kind of like crunching in on themselves. So let me ask this. How have you supported folks that have been passive on your team?
Well, going to the example you provided, what I would have done in the situation is I would have, if the person talking to me wanted to have a great relationship with me, I would have coached them like, this is a great idea. I'm 100% on board. We need to communicate this to the department or the team, but it shouldn't come from me. It should come from you, and whether you want to send that out via an email or, print it as, meeting notes before a meeting and pass out to everyone so they can read it before, so everybody knows what we're going to talk about. It's important to know that this information is coming from you, or this plan or this idea, because a lot of times to help passive people get past their issues, if you just acknowledge them, they're going to get out of that. And it's simply acknowledgement and be like, great idea. You take ownership of this and run with it. Could have been a way to help, avoid conflict in that specific scenario you provided.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to just kind of do bullets. Okay. So to support a passive communicator, and this is exactly what you just said, you want to kind of talk to them one-on-one, create that space for them to name what is so for them, offer different ways to communicate that is forcing them to, in a way, name what is so for them and what they want versus just going with the flow, and then provide that environment for them that is psychologically safe. And with that, I have so much gratitude for a previous podcast guest, and I just want to do a shout out to Shelly Taylor, who was on our podcast a bit ago talking about how to create culture and psychological safety within a team environment. So we will link that one in the show notes because it supports this one very specifically. And we're going to pause for a sponsor break, and we will be right back.
The People Strategy Podcast is sponsored by the Leadership Development Program offered through Elevated Talent Consulting. Do you have folks in your organization that have just been promoted from the doer to the leader? Well, we have a program specifically for you that trains on the specific ways for an individual to be a leader versus to be the doer of all of the things. In this program, we partner with learners to experience and create their own leadership around time management, delegation, coaching, accountability, and change management. Head to the link at the bottom of this page to find out more and sign up.
All right, well, welcome back. And we are chatting through 4 different communication types that impact conflict. And we just talked about passive, and now we're going to talk about aggressive. So I'm curious, Adam, do you have a scenario or a situation where someone has showed up very aggressive in their communication?
I do. And there's obviously different levels of aggressiveness that can be displayed during conflict. And I think one of the most common ones is if there is conflict between two people and one person feels stronger about whatever the conflict is than the other person, and they think that they are right, they might tend to raise their voice because, as you raise your voice and get louder, you must be right, because why else would you do that? That it doesn't necessarily always need to get to that point. That, some people are just quick to raise their voice because they get passionate about it and they get excited, and part of the conflict to be, well, I'm so passionate about this thing, why are you not? And that could be 100% not true, where they are passionate, but they just don't share it in the same displays that you do, where they can talk, at a very level voice and not get excited and raise their voice to match your level of, voice. And just having a conversation with a person that I know you're passionate about this, you don't need to go right to raising your voice. You can have a conversation and have it be even keel and not get excited. And I've had conversations with that, and, they've worked, but sometimes you got to give, either a cue or a quick friendly reminder that if it's happening again, like you have like a signal like, hey, bring it down. Like, you don't need to get so animated and so worked up. It doesn't do you any good, because you kind of come off as, I don't want to say like the crazy person, but like, look, she's raising her voice, she's yelling, like, just, hey, take a breath,
right?
Regroup.
And I think with aggressive, it can be with the voice, but I think it's more about dominating the conversation to not let anyone else have kind of that word in. It's like this position of authority. It's straightforward. This is the way it is. Here's where we're at. Dominating the conversation. That doesn't allow any room for anyone else to have the collaboration or the curiosity or the banter back and forth to determine what's even here, that we can look at the multiple competing priorities.
Right. And I think I can tie in aggressive and passive in a pretty good example that I experienced. That we were working on a project, and we had multiple teams all in a conference room to discuss where each team was on that specific project. And is anyone running into roadblocks? Let's talk about it. Let's go through. And there was someone who had a very aggressive personality, where it just always wanted to be talking, first one to answer the question, even if it wasn't necessarily the right answer, just had that natural trait of first one to speak. And I knew there was someone else in the room who had, better answers from talking to them outside of the group setting, but wasn't necessarily speaking up in that setting. And I pulled him aside and said, hey, I know you know the answers, and I know you have a better way forward, but why aren't you speaking? He's like, well, the other person is so quick to jump in, that he's so passionate and adamant that his answer is the right way, that why should I counteract that? And I said, okay, I got this. I think I know what I can do here. So the next time we met, I specifically asked the person who was, the person who would jump in so quickly to, just take a moment and let's give someone else in the room a chance to answer before you add what your thoughts are. And then I specifically called on the person who I knew had something to contribute and got them engaged. And they were able to start a conversation within the teams that led to a change in what we were doing, and led the project to be more successful. But it's needing to kind of identify the traits that are happening in the rooms, and how each person needs to be kind of coached to be able to bring out the best in themselves and the group.
Yeah, absolutely. And was it the last podcast that I sent you the predictive index link to say, go take your behavioral trait, right? Mm-hmm. So what I love about this is what we're seeing is, yes, sometimes it's very dominant, and our natural behaviors have a huge impact on how we show up, right? So we all have different communication styles, which leads into, the passive, the aggressive, et cetera. But folks that are very extroverted are much more likely to grab the reins and run with it, and thus may show up as aggressive, right? And yet, as leaders, when we know that we've got somebody that is very analytical, I tend to say these folks are no agenda, no attenda at meetings, meaning if they don't know what they're going to be called on to talk about, they're not going to show up and contribute in the meeting vocally, because they want to ensure that they have everything correct beforehand. And so I love the leadership that you showed here, because you're essentially saying, hey, I'm understanding different behavioral types. I'm understanding different communication styles and what the contributions that we need from everyone to move this forward. And we're setting it up both in the way that we set up the meeting, but also ensuring we're having the one-on-one with this individual ahead of time, that he or she has the ability to bring that forward to the team.
Sure. Yep.
Amazing. So for our cliff notes, right? The traits that we typically see for aggressive: dominate the conversation, prefer position of authority, straightforward or blunt. The behaviors that we typically see is the talked over or poor listening, kind of that intimidating others in the room, which it sounds like that was the case here. And so how do we support that aggressive communicator during the conflict? We're going to enforce the boundaries of what the expectations are, which you named. Here's what needs to, here, we're going to have this person talk first, and we want to give everyone an opportunity to share, et cetera. And then, a lot of times we're giving them an opportunity one-on-one where they can share what those things are, but it's also the conversation about the impact of the behaviors that are having that actually negatively impacts their influence within the team.
Yep. I think that was a good Cliff Notes version.
I mean, every now and then they're helpful, right?
Yep. Absolutely.
So, passive aggressive.
Yep.
We talked a little bit about this one earlier. So you had a great story before the break of the conversation with your supervisor and kind of the chip on your shoulder. And so traits of passive aggressive is passive on the surface, but shows this hidden resentment over time. Indirect with addressing the problem. You want everybody to know what it is, but you're not going to come out and say it. Right?
Absolutely.
So the behaviors are this frequent sarcasm, like the words don't necessarily align with the actions, the fine, whatever, just like this flippantness. So you gave a really great example of how your leader supported you within this. It was the one-on-one. It was, ensuring that you knew what the consequences of it were, but you also knew exactly, hey, here's what's behind it. So you knew the why. And that you had an opportunity to process that to create a different thought and make a different choice. Anything you'd add to those Cliff Notes versions?
The comment that you made that you're going to let everybody know what the problem is, but not necessarily do anything about it, is a spot on behavior of it. And I just want to add that that's not healthy for the culture of the team or the department, because everyone knows that there is a problem. And, at first they might be supportive and listening, but if you keep doing it over and over again, then the tendency is going to be, again, he's going to come over here. Like, why won't he just do something to address the problem and nip this in the bud? And it can have, a souring effect on teammates and the department if not addressed.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So let's talk about assertive communication. And assertive communication is essentially what we're going for and what we're looking for. And most of the time, I find, especially with new leaders, we don't catch ourselves in the other behaviors. So a lot of times it is pointed out, but really what we're leaning towards is really, that effective and healthy ways to express themselves, right? And giving some of those examples for folks so that they know, hey, when this comes up, here's a way that we can handle it. So when you're frustrated in a meeting, here's something that you may be able to say or whatnot. And you're creating that trust with each other, but you're also creating a way to share it in a way that doesn't have that negative impact. The open and honest dialogue, the confident and clear communication. And this is something I coach folks on all the time, is how to have the confidence in their communication, but ensure that they have the clarity within it. And a lot of times that may be writing it out. What are the points that you want to make and why, and how does that impact the business results?
Right. And one of those, I'll call things I've learned, that sometimes to make points across, write it out, but actually put bullet points in front of them, so you can actually visually see that these are important topics or something we need to address, or have a dialogue about. That visual cue of just seeing that bullet point helps even further get that point across.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And then those behaviors show up with they're expressing what they need with confidence. Again, bullet points. I think we've all heard this and probably rolled our eyes at it before. I know I have, but then it's like, okay, yes, and. But using I statements, right? Language is so powerful. And when we say they or them or you, it can be so accusatory, but I, or in my experience, and those kind of things brings it to, yep, I'm going to talk about my experience and the impact of that, or the way I see it is this, and the impact is, then you're not forcing anything on another person that can come off as aggressive or passive aggressive. That ability to say no. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say that being able to communicate with I think helps naturally bring down people's guard so that it isn't going to be so confrontational. That if you can phrase things in I think, or if I were to, you're kind of coaching, but also coaching to help diffuse any potential situations that may arise if you were to use or phrase it in a different way. And that's just an easy trick for a leader to use.
Yeah. And I mean, starting with I and then kind of throwing it back and even saying, hey, here's what we're trying to accomplish. What are the thoughts that the team has? And then following it up with the I, so that that's kind of the last thing that we're seeing. Now we can wrap around and come up with a resolution.
Absolutely.
And that, of course, encourages a balanced conversation. So those are the 4, communication types that we typically see: the passive, aggressive, passive aggressive, and assertive within that. And whenever we're solving conflict, and my guess is you saw this with your leader when you were talking about the promotion, is that trust truly is a linchpin to solving conflict. If we don't have trust in that psychological safety, it's really difficult to move anything forward.
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't have that trust established already, it's going to make whatever you're discussing be like, well, okay, but I don't know that I can believe them, because maybe you have an example of where trust was broken, or shady things were occurring, and like you fall back on that. I'm like, well, I don't know, like I'll pretend to be okay for now, but this problem isn't really resolved. If you have that trust, it's more easy to accept what is happening and believe that there is a plan or something else is going to occur. I just need to be patient, and without trust, that's not possible.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we wrap up this conversation on conflict resolution, I'm curious, what were your key takeaways from today's conversation?
One of the easiest ways to avoid conflict is to, just hold your team accountable and have clear communication as to what the expectations are. If you communicate clearly, and this is what I need, by when, you're setting, a baseline for, having things done where conflict can be avoided. Because if you're unclear, well, I wasn't sure what you needed by when, can lead to conflict. If you establish that early, you're in a much better space. And then being able to identify, I would say, personality traits of people helps make resolving conflict easier too. Because if you can understand how they tend to act, if they're an introvert versus an extrovert, or other personality tendencies that they have, it allows you to target resolution quicker and more effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, within those personality, I'll throw the predictive index link in there if anyone wants to take that and kind of say, okay, what is this for me? And, I'm curious what this looks like for my team, because it's really fun when you throw the whole team together and you go, oh, that's where that conflict's coming from, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Amazing. So, again, thank you so much for being with us this week in our leadership development program as we talk through some of the key leadership development traits. And with that, if you are interested in that program, check it out in the show notes, and we will see you back here next week. Thanks so much.
Thanks. Take care. Be good.
Thank you so much for listening today. I'd love to connect with you. If you'd like to connect, you can find me on LinkedIn at Tracy, TRACI Austin, and at our website at elevatedtalentconsulting.com. If you'd love to learn more about our process, please reach out to us. And again, thank you so much for listening and sharing your feedback with us through a review. Have a fantastic day.